Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome to another presentation by IET Berkshire. I'm Anthony Bardos. I'm the chair of IET Berkshire. And tonight we are hosting Andrew Feinstein. Andrew is a former ANC MP under Nelson Mandela and the author of the acclaimed book and film, The Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade. He's also executive director of Shadow World Investigations. Over to you, Andrew. Oh, sorry, before I say it, if anyone's got any questions, put them in the Q&A, and because we're going to have a Q&A at the end. Andrew's going to talk for about 40 to 50 minutes. So any questions that occur to you, chuck them in the Q&A and we'll deal with those at the end. Okay, cheers. Andrew.
Thanks so much, Anthony. You would think that after so long in lockdown, we would have all got a bit better at unmuting ourselves. So I was glad for the two opportunities to get it right. Thank you very much for arranging this evening. And thank you so much to so many of you for joining in this conversation. I have been working on the global arms trade for over 20 years now, just over 20 years. And I'll explain to you how I came to work on this particular area. It was not something I imagined working on. My academic background, I have numerous degrees from numerous parts of the world, only because I was of a generation of South Africans who had to study endlessly to avoid serving in the apartheid military. So obviously, the starting point of a discussion like this is the very important reality that the United Nations Charter explicitly gives nation states the right to defend themselves. And growing out of that right, there exists a global trade in weaponry that some of you in the audience, I would imagine, know extremely well from the perspective of your profession as engineers. I should state that the one thing I've never studied is engineering. I have studied clinical psychology. I have studied economics and finance extensively, but I am by no means an engineer of any sort and wouldn't pretend to be. But of course, there are many aspects of the arms trade that are entirely legitimate and, in my opinion, are required. However, as I discovered through my own personal experience initially, which I will describe very briefly, the way in which the trade functions is, to a large extent, underregulated for so important a trade in so dangerous a product. It obviously is complicit in human rights abuses, in numerous violations of international humanitarian law, sometimes the rules of war, and sometimes in war crimes. But also, and what is far less spoken and written about, is that an enormous amount of what is blatant criminal conduct takes place in the trade in weapons, to the extent that as a senior researcher at Transparency International some years ago, a gentleman by the name of Joe Rober calculated on the basis of information that he gleaned from national treasuries that he'd worked with as an intermediary in the oil industry, from some of the world's most important and powerful intelligence agencies. He calculated that the trade in weapons accounts for around 40% of all corruption in all global trade. And what this often results in is that equipment is bought not because it is the most appropriate equipment for a particular purpose, but rather because it is attached to the largest bribes on offer. Now, when I wrote The Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade, which interestingly was the first book published on the global arms trade. The first edition was published in late 2011, and it is now in its 10th edition. A 10th edition has just been published in Korean. The previous book on the global arms trade had been first published in 1979, written by a brilliant author called Anthony Sampson, a book called The Arms Bazaar. When I concluded the Shadow World manuscript, some of my researchers, and I used 25, 26 researchers around the world and traveled extensively around the world to research the book. Some of my researchers were a little disappointed because I am not a pacifist. I understand the need for an arms trade that makes us safer. But to do so, we require a properly regulated arms trade that is open to scrutiny, that is open to the rule of law, and that is open to accountability that must lie at the heart of any functioning democracy. For this reason, and to overcome the reason that there had been so little published work on the arms trade, this book is not quite as daunting as it appears. One reviewer described it as, especially in its hardback version, looking something like a weapon of mass destruction. But actually, a third of the book is almost 3,000 footnotes, very tiny footnotes, as you can probably see there, that have been diminished in size by the publisher to make the size of the book appear slightly more reasonable. And I think that's extremely important, that everything that myself and my research colleagues write on the trade is based on documentary evidence. And when one reads the book, when we make a claim or an allegation, you can then immediately refer to the sourcing for that claim or allegation, in many instances to the documentary evidence. And the reason that I was able to do that had something to do with the way in which I came to investigate the global arms trade. So, as Anthony mentioned in his kind introduction, I was an ANC member of parliament in South Africa. I was born and brought up in South Africa. I had been involved in the struggle against apartheid from my late teens from the early 1980s. And it had to leave the country in the mid-1980s, as I mentioned, to avoid serving in the apartheid military. Returned to South Africa when the ANC was unbanned, when Mandela and others were released from prison. And I acted as a facilitator in the constitutional negotiations that led to our first democratic elections in 1994, which is when I was elected. Because of my background and the fact that very few people in the ANC had much of a background in economics and finance, I landed up chairing the subcommittee of the Finance Committee that drafted South Africa's public sector financial management legislation. And once that was done, I then became the ranking or most senior ANC member on the Public Accounts Committee, which functions much like the Public Accounts Committee here. It's a key check and balance on financial management in the public sector. And it looks at all state spending from the previous financial year through the Office of the Auditor General, who makes regular reports to the committee, which then interrogates and investigates those reports further. And I came across the arms trade, as I said before, knowing absolutely nothing about it initially. When a report came from the Auditor General's office of a $10 billion arms deal that my own government had entered into in 1999. So as Mandela was leaving office and his successor, President Thabo Mbeki, was taking over, Mbeki had really been the driving force behind this arms deal. Now, we had a public process in the spirit of our new democracy to determine the sorts of defense needs that the country had. And you won't be surprised to hear that it was found that our armed services required fairly small modernizations. The apartheid state had been very, very heavily armed. A huge percentage of our annual budget as a percentage of GDP was spent on defense to maintain the system of apartheid, both internally and externally. And this public process involving military officials, but also qualified and interested members of the public and civil society, determined that we needed about 7 billion rand of modernizations for the sort of armed forces that we required in our new democracy. We spent well over 142 billion rand on an enormous amount of equipment, most of which we didn't need, a huge amount of which has never been used until today. Now, the primary reason for this arms deal wasn't, in fact, the modernization of our armed forces. It was because over $350 million of bribes were paid to senior politicians who were involved in the decisions about what to buy and who to buy it from, senior officials in a variety of government departments, primarily the Department of Defense, but also some other departments, our state arms companies, Denel and Arms Corps, where senior executives also received some of those bribes, and to a huge number of intermediaries. The impact of this, because our state president, Thabo Mbeki, was quite willing to undermine the institutions of our new democracy that he had played an incredibly important role in bringing about, that many, many thousands of South Africans had died to bring about. He was prepared to undermine these institutions, from our parliament to our anti-corruption bodies, the main one of which was simply closed down because it was too zealous in its enthusiasm to investigate the corruption in this deal. Our prosecutorial services were deeply, deeply politicized. When the chief prosecutor would not follow the president's orders, he was simply replaced by a colleague of mine from Parliament, an ANC member of Parliament who had a legal background, was simply put into the role of the Director of Public Prosecutions. I was supposed to be in South Africa as we speak now, giving evidence in the corruption trial of our then Deputy President and subsequent President, Jacob Zuma, who is on trial along with Thales, the French arms company, for bribes he received in relation to the arms deal. I am one of 208 state witnesses against him, and his legal team has been delaying this trial for well over 13 years now and continues to try and do that. So I think it would be fair to say that what this arms deal did is 5 years into our new democracy. It corrupted individual politicians, it corrupted my own political party, the ANC, and it therefore corrupted our nascent democracy. But the impacts were even more profound than that. At the same time that he had announced that we would be spending $10 billion on weapons, President Mbeki informed the nation that we did not have the finances to provide antiretroviral medication to the over 6 million South Africans living with HIV or AIDS. According to a study conducted at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, they conservatively estimated that that policy choice over the next 5 years resulted in the avoidable deaths of 365,000 South Africans and resulted in 32,000 babies a year every year for those 5 years, and of course beyond, but they only looked at the next 5 years, being born HIV positive, because we could not afford to provide mother-to-child transmission treatment. But we could afford to buy jet fighters, jet trainers, some of which have never even been assembled, let alone leave the ground. At this stage, unbeknownst to me, corruption was nothing new in the global arms trade. For a few years before, Britain had been involved in what is probably the most corrupt commercial transaction in history. An arms deal called the Al-Yamamah deal that I'm sure many of you have heard of, between the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia, in which 43 billion pounds of weaponry, of services and spare parts were sold to Saudi Arabia, primarily by BAE Systems, and in which 6 billion pounds of commissions were paid. Now, the vast majority of those commissions went to senior members of the Saudi royal family, and I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. But some of those so-called commissions found their way back to the United Kingdom in what is known in the arms trade world as the feedback principle. So Mark Thatcher, the son of then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, received 12 million pounds from one of the key intermediaries in that transaction. Sir Richard Evans, executive chair of BAE Systems at the time of the deal, received a rather large apartment in Mayfair in West London, estimated to be worth £6.5 million in the 1980s, from another of the intermediaries in the transaction. And the reality is that these bribes are built into the costs, which is one of the reasons why South Africa paid a 35% premium on the jet fighters that it purchased, by comparison to, for instance, Australia, who purchased the identical fighters, but without the bribes. On the Al-Yamamah deal, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who was the son of the Saudi defense minister at the time, and the country's ambassador to the United States, and the person who negotiated initially directly with Margaret Thatcher, received over £1 billion paid into his accounts in Riggs Bank in Washington, D.C., just opposite the White House. And no one was particularly interested in that money, was particularly perturbed by the size of that bribe. It only became of interest to a Senate investigative committee that was exploring terrorist financing in the United States of America in the wake of the tragedy of 9/11. And this inquiry found that some of the money made its way into the account of Bandar's wife in the same Riggs Bank, and into the accounts of 2 of the 9/11 hijackers. It is also worth bearing in mind that Prince Bandar, in case the over £1 billion in commissions was not sufficient, was given as a birthday present by BAE Systems a jet painted in the colors of his favorite American football team, the Dallas Cowboys. We managed to trace records all the way through 2011, which is when the book was published, but in subsequent investigations through to 2017, we haven't investigated post-2017, where the British taxpayer was still contributing to the maintenance and upkeep of President Bandar's jet. Now, it would be really good to think that perhaps this is in our past. Perhaps after a number of embarrassing investigations, none of which resulted in legal prosecution, but rather in settlements that in the arms business are described as the cost of doing business on the rare occasions when settlements have to be entered into. Because the vast majority of corruption cases, as I indicate in the book, are never investigated. It would be good to think that this was in our past, that this was now unusual in the global trade in arms. But just over 2 months ago, the Serious Fraud Office settled with yet another British arms company, GPT Systems, a subsidiary of Airbus, for corruption in relation to a military communication project with Saudi Arabia. Unusually in this case, the company had to admit to one count of corruption. But the whistleblower in the case, who was a former British military officer and a military communications specialist who was sent to Saudi Arabia as the project manager, said when he arrived in the country that there seemed virtually no interest in the actual military communication system. The primary interest seemed to be in the bribes. And he very bravely, along with someone else in the company, blew the whistle on that transaction. But even the fact that it led to a settlement, that the case was investigated because this was a very brave and a very loud whistleblower, is extremely unusual. Because in the case of most arms deals around the world, whatever happens in them happens with relative impunity. So, of the literally hundreds of cases of corruption that I mention in the book, less than a dozen have ever been investigated. Of the 502 recorded violations of UN arms embargoes, where companies, countries, or individuals have sold weapons into conflicts on which there is an embargo. Of the 502, only 2 have resulted in any form of legal accountability. One of the key reasons that this happened is that these deals are often very large deals, worth billions of pounds or dollars. Not that many of them take place every year, as many of you know. They take place behind a veil of national security imposed secrecy, which is used quite legitimately to conceal certain information that nobody would want in the public domain, but is also used to conceal what is often simply illegal and or criminal conduct. And it is extremely difficult for prosecutors, for law enforcement authorities to actually pursue these cases. It is frowned upon because they are politically highly sensitive cases, and it can do enormous damage to prosecutors, which I've seen at a very senior level in the UK, at a middling level in European countries like Austria and France. The other reason that so few of these cases of criminal conduct see the light of day is because of the incredibly close links between many of these companies, defense companies, and their governments, for the obvious reasons that they play an important role in defense and national security. The so-called revolving door, the movement of senior people between companies, various arms of the state, be it the military, intelligence services, political life. The so-called revolving door, which is seen in its most extreme variant in the United States of America, where, for instance, in the year 2016, 84% of the generals retiring from the Pentagon went into very high-paying senior executive positions at defense companies to whom they had given contracts during their time in the Pentagon. Now, unfortunately, the United Kingdom and Europe have, in recent years, started catching up with the US in terms of the pace of the revolving door. But there is another dimension to these relationships that is extremely important. And that is that part of the feedback principle sometimes benefits individual politicians who move from the cabinet table to the boardroom table in one of our large defense companies, or into executive positions in some of our large defense companies. There is a former Secretary of Defense who, after leaving office, became the Director of International Sales for a large Anglo-Italian company that has been implicated in a significant number of major international corruption cases. But there's another dimension that is as important as those individual levels, and that is the role of the arms trade in funding political parties. So we have tracked, for instance, the amounts of donations that were made to the party in power in the United Kingdom at the time of the Al-Yamamah deal, to a different party in power at the time of a series of other BAE deals, including the South African deal. In France, that is even more common than in the United Kingdom. In Germany, it is surprisingly common, and I can talk about all of those in more detail if there's any interest in that. In the United States, it is on a completely different dimension, where the system of campaign contributions from companies then being effectively paid back, if you will, in contracts going to those same companies is what an aide on Capitol Hill described to me as legalized bribery. So, on the South African deal, almost 50% of the bribes went to my own political party, the ruling party, the ANC. And it is on the basis of those bribes that we contested our second democratic election in 1999. But what of the use of the weapons? Because I'm now talking about the corroding impact of the arms trade on our democracies, on the rule of law, on how clean our public finances are, on how clean our political systems are. But of course, the products themselves have an impact. It is estimated that just over 501,000 people are killed around the world with various sorts of weapons. Now, the most obvious manifestation of this in recent times has been the conflict in Yemen. And what makes the conflict in Yemen stand out in the way it does is that for the first time, we have numerous reports from UN expert panels identifying the unacceptable reality that all parties to the conflict, but primarily the Saudi and UAE-led coalition, have been intentionally targeting civilian targets. These include schools, hospitals, places of residence, places of worship, and economic infrastructure, factories, agricultural fields. In any conflict, there is the tragedy of what are called victims of collateral damage, where people who find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, too close to a particular site of conflict, are killed, injured. But in the case of Yemen, the 3 UN expert panels have reported to the Security Council of myriad instances in which the targeting has been intentional. A variety of human rights organizations, including an organization spread across the country of Yemen called Muwatana for Human Rights in Yemen, have similarly documented even more abuses of the intentional targeting. This has resulted in over 100,000 deaths, including over 20,000 civilian deaths. It has resulted in one of the poorest countries in the world in the worst humanitarian crisis of our generation. But what it signifies, perhaps more than anything, is the complete and utter failure of arms export controls in the United Kingdom, in the United States of America, in Germany, in France, in Spain. To focus for a moment on the United Kingdom, British weaponry, planes, ordnance, missiles and bombs have been sold in huge quantities to Saudi Arabia, not just in the lead up to the Yemen conflict, which really Saudi Arabia and the UAE got intensively involved in from March 2015, where Britain has sold just in excess of £20 billion of weaponry to Saudi Arabia alone since March of 2015. A very senior lawyer at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, whose job it was both to advise the government and to defend the government in various legal actions brought against it by civil society in relation to the use of British weapons in Yemen, got to the point where she could no longer defend the government. She resigned, and she stated publicly that she believed the British government was violating British domestic law, was violating its own arms export control criteria, was violating the International Arms Trade Treaty, to which we are a signatory, and during its drafting, we were a champion. But as bad as that, as bad as she, as a lawyer, felt that her government was intentionally breaking its own laws, and it is worth noting that after the appeal court reversed a high court decision and declared British arms sales to Saudi Arabia unlawful in terms of British law, the government continued with at least 3 exports of weaponry to Saudi Arabia. And when the relevant minister, Ms. Truss, was asked in Parliament about those exports, she put them down to bureaucratic and administrative error. But what concerned Molly Mulready, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office lawyer, even more than the blatant violation of domestic and international law, was that she said the foreign secretaries she briefed and the two prime ministers she briefed showed not one iota of interest in or concern for the tens of millions of civilians in Yemen who are enduring the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And for her, that compounded the breaking of the law. Parliamentary oversight, checks and balances of our arms export controls are pretty much non-existent. We have something called the Committees on Arms Export Controls, which is not a standing committee of Parliament. It is an informal committee comprised of members of 4 other committees. For a long period of time, it didn't even meet because the different political parties couldn't agree on how to address the issue of Saudi Arabia. So the committee reconvened in the previous parliament, but on the understanding that they would not discuss arms sales to Saudi Arabia, which is, of course, the biggest recipient of British weapons. The committee's reports, which have been fairly mild and anodyne, have been ignored by the government. For the world's oldest parliament, this is an incredibly worrying state of affairs. We have recently seen in the occupied Palestinian territories brutal attacks by the Israeli Defense Force, sometimes based on no precipitating factors, occasionally based on very isolated rocket fire from the occupied territories into parts of Israel. But what has been described as an extreme, brutal, and disproportionate attack on Gaza, in which literally hundreds of civilians were killed. Now, this, of course, is in addition to the reality that Israel is engaged in a dehumanizing, brutal, and illegal occupation of Palestine. And I say this as somebody who grew up privileged in an apartheid state in South Africa. And I say this as someone who is Jewish, who is the son of a Holocaust survivor who lost almost 40 members of her family in the Holocaust, and who has family in Israel. And British weapons and British cooperation with the Israeli Defense Force continues unabated and unabashed. I believe this too is in violation of the consolidated criteria that are supposed to govern arms exports from this country to ensure that those exports do not seriously endanger civilian life and do not intensify or lengthen existing conflict. But of course, an argument we often hear about the global arms trade in its very bloated size, and I'll explain in a moment why I use the word bloated. We are told that the trade is essential to our economies. And there is no doubt that it makes a contribution to the economy. Some of you are employed in the industry, so it clearly generates employment. But there is a consensus amongst economists, and this is in most of the arms-producing countries of the world, Europe, the United States of America, where most of the studies have been done, that in economic terms, and here I feel more comfortable as I said, more of an economist than an engineer, that the defense sector, in terms of the number of jobs and the contribution to GDP created by the extent of public investment in the sector, is a very economically inefficient way to create jobs and grow GDP. In fact, there are 3 different economic studies that we cite in another book we've produced called Indefensible: 7 Myths that Sustain the Global Arms Trade, which you can see and read for free online at projectindefensible.org, where these 3 studies are mentioned, that suggest that for the amount of public investment, and public investment is interestingly highest in the United States of America in its defense industry, and that's obviously a product of the size of the industry. But it is significant in countries of Europe and the United Kingdom as well. That in other more socially and, importantly, economically productive sectors, you can create, for every 1 job created in the defense sector, 3 to 7 jobs at an equivalent level in sectors such as renewable energy and various others. Those studies are interesting to read. The arms trade relies on an extremely narrow definition of security. It uses the notion of national security, in which threats to our safety, threats to our nations, are defined as the primary threats facing us. I believe that this is a very reductionist and a not particularly compelling way in which to look at human security. Because amongst the threats that face us include quite clearly health pandemics, and perhaps the greatest challenge and threat facing us is the climate crisis. Now, I don't have the time here to address the issue of defense and COVID-19. I've done so in a video on a media channel called Double Down News, which if you search Double Down News online and look for my name, Andrew Feinstein, you'll find some of my thoughts on that. But I will take a moment to ponder the role of the arms trade in relation to the climate crisis that faces us. The Cost of War project at Brown University in the United States of America has identified the Pentagon as the biggest institutional polluter on the planet. There are estimates, although they haven't done the work on this, but there are estimates that I haven't seen as compelling evidence for, so I can't say this with any degree of authority, but it is a possibility that China's military establishment is probably the 2nd largest institutional polluter on the planet. In terms of one of the dirtiest fuels in our atmosphere, jet fuel, 25% of all jet fuel used comes out of military jets. Conflict itself destroys the natural environment in the areas in which the conflict takes place. There are a number of devastating studies about the environmental degradation of Yemen over the almost 6 years, over 6 years of this conflict, including how the soil in the few fertile regions of the country has been completely despoiled. And of course, conflict has the impact of displacing millions of people. And one of the consequences that we have seen, particularly from studies in South Asia, is that displacement of communities also has an incredibly negative impact on the environment and on climate. So it's on the basis of these few areas that I have touched on, and I apologize given the limits of time that we have for having done so in a fairly superficial and simplistic way. A lot of the detail of this is in this book and in subsequent books like Indefensible. We are currently working on a book on the Yemen conflict and the arms trade, called, unsurprisingly, Making a Killing. And we use that term because so many people are making so much money out of the conflict in Yemen that I fear that that is a contributory factor to why there has not been a resolution to the conflict. And I say that without having gone into any detail about the role of intermediaries in the trade, the role of so-called arms dealers, agents, or brokers, depending on the specific role that they perform. But I'm very happy in the Q&A to talk far more about them. These are people who, there is this sort of the almost caricature of the arms dealer that is portrayed in the film Lord of War, starring Nicolas Cage, who is a composite character based on 4 or 5 quite well-known arms dealers. Many of these intermediaries aren't these sort of shadowy figures who move in insalubrious environments, arranging bribes, ensuring the money is appropriately laundered so that it cannot be traced. Many of them are establishment figures who are very well thought of in society, who have university departments named after them. Many of them have philanthropies in their names. And the impact that they have on the world is profound and devastating. But we very seldom hear about that side of what they do. So, having seen the impacts of the arms trade in my own country, having at first thought that we were perhaps politically naive because we were so inexperienced, none of us had any experience of government when we landed up in government. I thought that we'd just been effectively hoodwinked by governments, companies, intermediaries. And as I started researching our own arms deal and its impact on South Africa's politics, South Africa's economy, I began to realize that what happened in South Africa happens all over the world, all the time. At the time that BAE Systems was paying £115 million of bribes in South Africa, according to police reports in the United Kingdom, BAE Systems, with a great deal of help from the British government and number 10 Downing Street, were paying similar bribes in 7 other countries at the same time, totaling well over £1 billion in bribes. So, it is my contention that if the arms trade continues as it currently functions, it will continue to make the world a less democratic place, a far more corrupt place, and perhaps most ironic of all, a far less safe place for all of us. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was very, very interesting indeed. So if you've got any questions, pop them in the Q&A. There's a couple of quick admin questions here which I can answer. Will this session be available to watch after the event? Yes, we're recording the session, so that will be available online probably next week, I think. And is this subject to continual professional development? Yeah, this is 1 hour. We put this down as 1 hour of continual professional development. So you can pop that in your CV. So let's see, there's been quite a few questions about what can be done to regulate the arms industry and what sort of solutions would that offer. Do you want to speak a bit about that, Andrew?
Absolutely. In some countries, including the United Kingdom, the actual regulations on paper are not bad. And if one takes our arms export control regulations in this country, I mean, they could do with bits and pieces of tightening up. No, as I discovered as a legislator, no law is perfect. If you take that together with our anti-bribery legislation, one should have a fairly intimidating package of regulation to stop this sort of behavior. This applies even more so to a country like Germany, where the arms export controls are more rigorous than the United Kingdom. But in both countries, the problem is a profound lack of political will. And I noticed one of the other questions that was in the Q&A, just as I glanced at them quickly now, asked about, well, you know, in South Africa, you describe the fact that you designed this public sector financial management system, and then the government simply operated with impunity. Unfortunately, in a situation where checks and balances are not enforced properly, in a situation where political friendly people are put into key positions in these institutions that are supposed to hold our governments, and particularly the executive branch of government, to account, it doesn't matter how good your laws are. It doesn't matter how well drafted they are. They can simply be ignored. So in the South African case, key institutions were simply headed by political appointees who would do the bidding of their political master. And the South African case is perhaps more extreme than the British case because we have a pure proportional representation system of government. So when you're elected to parliament, you're elected on a party list. And if you vote against your party, if you speak against your party, the party simply has the right to remove you from their list and put the next person into parliament. So you're entirely dependent on your party leadership for your political career. So you don't have a constituency who actually elect you. In the United Kingdom, where you have the first past the post system, which also has its problems, as many people have said, around representation, etc., the one advantage you do have is that if you were elected as an MP for a particular political party, you can say to your constituents that this party is violating what it stood for in the election, and therefore I can no longer justify being a member of this party. And in instances, the membership or the electorate in your constituency will continue to support you as their constituency member of parliament. But I think the key thing about regulation is that there is a requirement of political will in order to get the regulations that exist, the laws that exist, to actually be followed. And this becomes more difficult in an area of the law that is governed by national security restrictions, which the arms trade is. So even when a legal review is brought in the High Court against the British government on a specific arms export that members of the society believe does not conform to the law, those people bringing the review are not even allowed to hear the majority of the testimony that is given by the government to the judge. So there is nobody questioning what the government is saying. There is nobody questioning the assumptions that are implicit in that. And unfortunately, national security, the hold-all of national security, has been used to stop meaningful investigations into a number of the cases that I've spoken about. So, the most corrupt of them all, the Al-Yamamah deal. Tony Blair closed down the Serious Fraud Office's 5.5-year investigation into the Al-Yamamah arms deal, in which £6 billion of commissions, what most people understand as bribes, were paid. The deputy director of the SFO, who led that investigation, who described it as a case in which there was more evidence of criminal conduct than any other case in the history of the SFO, was first told she had to close the case because there was insufficient evidence, which she refused to do. She was subsequently told that she had to close the case for reasons of national security, because if she didn't, the Saudis had sworn that there would be blood on the streets of London. An appeal court judge, when he heard that, said the member of the Saudi royal family who had said that should be found in contempt of British court and should be brought to justice in Britain for threatening the people of Britain. But the investigation was closed down. The only report by Britain's National Audit Office that has never been made public, that has never even been made available to members of parliament, is the report into the Al-Yamamah arms deal that caused the SFO to investigate. So while the regulations and laws on paper can be extremely good, unless there is that political will, politicians will avoid scrutiny of this particular trade from which they derive benefit. So what can we do about it? The most important thing to remind ourselves is that we are employees, we are citizens, we are the electorate, and we are taxpayers. Now, I come from a country that is very heavily politicized. So in South Africa, there are on average, probably before lockdown started, 18 social protests per day. Many of them very small social protests about local corruption or lack of service delivery locally. But people are not prepared to just sit back and accept that their politicians are corrupt or useless or their government officials are useless. They take a stand against it. In the United Kingdom, we should be holding our elected representatives, our government ministers, and our officials to account, because the reality is that the way in which we conduct our arms trade is done using our tax pounds and in our names. And that opposition can manifest in multiple ways. There was one case where a particular MP who had been business secretary in a coalition government, and he had passed some truly appalling arms deals, including one in which gunboats were sold, and you can read about this case on our website, which is shadowworldinvestigations.org. Gunboats had been sold from Norway through the UK to a warlord in Nigeria. Now, the reason the official in Norway ensured that the deal came through a front company in the UK was because he knew that it was illegal for Norway to sell these arms straight to this warlord in the Niger Delta. In fact, this warlord in the 9 months leading up to the British decision, stated on numerous occasions that if his presidential candidate in Nigeria was not elected president, he would he would reinvigorate the civil war that had been waged in the Niger Delta. But in spite of that information, or in ignorance of that information, which is even more worrying, this minister decided to approve this particular export. The official in Norway went to jail for 3 years and had to pay back the bribes he'd received from the Nigerians. In the United Kingdom, there has never even been an inquiry into this arms export. But at his next election, and he had a huge majority in his constituency, a small group of his constituency appeared at every single campaign event that this MP did, reminding him of the arms deals he had approved as business secretary. And in a major shock, he lost his seat and was out of parliament. So that is the sort of action that can take place that builds in a more direct form of accountability. I think it is also about strengthening our democracy so that where checks and balances don't exist or aren't working as they should, we demand and insist that they be put in place. It is incomprehensible that the British Parliament does not have a standing committee with all of the powers that involves in Parliament that acts as a check and balance on British arms exports. It is extraordinary. And we should be outside Parliament once the pandemic, we hope, is finally over, demanding that such accountability be put in place. In terms of reducing corruption in the arms trade, there are two very easy legal or regulatory changes that could take place. One involving the use of intermediation in arms deals, where it should be necessary either to ban the use of intermediaries, because about 87% of all corruption in arms transactions goes through intermediaries, or every company and government involved in the transaction should have to make public what intermediaries they're using, how much they're paying those intermediaries, and what they're being paid for, so that they cannot do what, for instance, BAE and Saab did in the South African case, where they had as an agent the political advisor to the defense minister responsible for the arms deal. And when they were asked by a prosecutor in Sweden, not in the UK, as to what this agent had ever done for them, because he got paid 58 million euros, they managed to produce a 1.5-page report on the politics and economics of South Africa that, frankly, when my daughter was a 12-year-old, she could have done a better job of. So that would immediately make it much more difficult to corrupt in arms deals. The banning of the use of offsets in arms transactions would also have a huge impact on cutting down the amount of corruption. And we have been engaged in a piece of work with the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime, which is responsible for the United Nations Coalition Against Corruption, in trying to draft model legislation that could lead to these two changes in some national legislation. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to political will. And we as citizens have to try and impose that political will on our elected representatives. Sorry, that was a very long answer, Anthony. I promise to be briefer.
Okay, well, I'll link together a couple of questions here. I would say this is sort of a bit of a summary. Are there any politicians who are trying to take on the arms industry apart from yourself? What can individuals do? And what organizations are there promoting peace, and should they be supported?
So, in every parliament, there are a very small group of MPs who try and work diligently on these issues. In the British Parliament at the moment, there are 2 or 3 Labour MPs who have done some very good work on this topic. They include Zara Sultana, Richard Burgon, Lloyd Russell Moyle. There are a couple of MPs in the Scottish National Party who have done some important work on this issue in Parliament. There is, and I'm not sure, I don't think he is still an MP. There was one Liberal Democrat MP who got very involved in trying to expose some of the corruption that I've spoken about. At one point, he actually went public with the information that Parliament security services had discovered that his office in Parliament had been bugged. And he said publicly that he thought it had been bugged by BAE systems. Jeremy Corbyn, as an individual politician, has been involved in anti-arms trade work for decades and decades. As leader of the Labour Party, which he was for a few years, he proposed in 2 manifestos, election manifestos, that if his party was returned to government on the day that they entered government, he would suspend all arms sales to non-democratic and or authoritarian regimes while British arms export policy was reviewed. Of course, he didn't come to power. So, we're talking about maybe half a dozen people in a parliament of 500 plus MPs. And we work very closely with them. They have a lot on their plates. This isn't the only thing they work on, but it is very good to have their support. There are a lot of organizations. I'll focus just on the UK because there are a lot of global organizations as well, working on peace issues, working specifically on arms trade issues. There is an organization that has been around since the 1970s that was started by Quakers called Campaign Against Arms Trade, known colloquially as CAT, C-A-A-T. Their website is extraordinary in the way in which it tracks UK arms deals around the world and arms sales around the world. The gold standard of data on arms exports and imports is an organization based in Stockholm called the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, and it produces a yearbook every year that we all regard as close to the gold standard we can get on who exports and imports what weaponry. Governments are not very transparent in the arms exports, even though they're supposed to be in terms of the International Arms Trade Treaty that was passed at the UN or that was promulgated at the UN in mid-2014. Even the United Kingdom has not kept up with its transparency requirements on the ATT, as it's referred to. So even SIPRI acknowledged that their data can't be perfect. And then there are a number of countries who provide very little information on their arms, particularly on their arms imports, but also their arms exports. And amongst those would be countries like Equatorial Guinea in Africa. Israel is very opaque in terms of its arms exports and imports. North Korea, which won't come as a surprise to you, and China. Russia is not as bad as those, but what it makes public is not great. Amongst the best are countries like Norway, Holland. I wish there were more examples I could say, but that is where most information has gone. And then there are a number of other organizations. Oxfam and Amnesty do a great deal of work on general human rights abuses, on peace generally, that I think are very important. There are a number of Quaker groups who do a lot of work on the UK's role in peacemaking around the world. And I think all of these organizations are worth looking at, and if you're interested in this stuff, are certainly worth getting involved with and supporting. There are, you won't be surprised to hear, numerous organizations across UK campuses, and over the last 6 to 8 years, I have noticed the development or the springing up of a lot of local community organizations all over the United Kingdom who have started to take an interest in some of these issues. So I've been asked to talk in a period of less than 2 years. I traveled 25,000 miles in the UK, showing the film based on the Shadow World book and giving talks about the arms trade to local communities.
Thank you, Andrew. So there have been a couple of questions about cyber weaponry. Can you comment on the power of the tech sector and trade in information, cyber capabilities in war? And there was a bit of a question about how much of cyber was involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Well, I'm assuming that because that's when the question was asked when you were talking about it.
So, sorry, I just have to respond to my daughter. My apologies. I'm by no means an expert in cyber weapons or cyber warfare. We obviously keep track of cyber weapons and cyber warfare. They are not included in the SIPRI statistics, for instance. There is as yet no organization anywhere in the world that I'm aware of that attempts to compile national and or international statistics. There is more and more work being done on it, so we are seeing more and more information in the United Kingdom. And this would span across not just cyber weaponry, but also surveillance weaponry. And often those who do work on weapons that are used for repressive purposes and torture are sometimes, perhaps inappropriately, lumped in with some cyber weapons. So, for instance, there is an organization called Omega Research Foundation based in Manchester who do work across that piece of weaponry. And in terms of the politics and the economics of the trade in these weapons and the violations, the legal violations in relation to these weapons, it is very similar to what I've set out for what we call the conventional trade in weapons or the trade in conventional weapons. Of course, there are some differences. This is an area in which Israel dominates. Israel acts as something of a technological hub for the American defense sector. The American defense sector is the biggest in the world, which I'm sure you all know, accounting for around 40% of all weapons that are produced in the world. But America's around $4 billion a year in aid to Israel is primarily for the work that Israel does that is fed in, not just to the Pentagon, but also to American defense contractors and obviously to Israeli companies as well who work a great deal with American contractors. And yes, an enormous amount of, let's call it high-tech weaponry, has been used in the occupied territories. So let me give you one example that is not immediately current, but an Israeli company, Elbit Systems Limited, which has 9 or 8, we're not quite sure, production facilities in the UK, because it is possible that one of those facilities has very recently been closed down. There's sort of conflicting information about that. Elbit was probably the premier pioneer in drone technology globally. And I managed, before I published on the subject, I was able to get into arms fairs around the world where I could see the weapons being marketed. And I managed to get into a presentation, which was extremely difficult to get into because it had very restricted and secure entry, Not that secure that I couldn't find a way in, but pretty secure. And Elbit was showing on huge IMAX screens their drones undertaking both surveillance functions in the occupied territories and taking out targets in the occupied territories. And I have to say that I found it terrifying. And there were generals from all sorts of countries, many of them countries that one wouldn't want to have anything to do with, seated in these very plush leather chairs watching this. And there were very attractive young women at the knee of every general, giving the general commentary on how a suspect would be identified using various surveillance techniques and various technologies that Israel was specializing in, how they would then be surveilled to pick up their patterns, their movements by drones, and how the drones would then take them out without ever killing a civilian, which of course is what governments and companies always claim. And unfortunately, as I'm sure many of you know, even what we describe as precision-guided weaponry has resulted in very significant collateral damage around the world. So Israeli cyber warfare, I think, is something that we are seeing evidence of in many parts of the world. We've seen with the Pegasus project, for instance, we have seen information being made public that takes very particular technologies to be able to access. And again, this is something that Israel is at the forefront of. There are a whole range of consultancies such as Black Cube that is has become quite well known. Probably the best of them we don't know anything about at all, would be my guess. And because Israel's economy is so dependent on the defense sector and the homeland security sector, where it markets its weapons and its technology as battle tested, and where after every incursion into the occupied territories, there is an arms fair that talks specifically about how those weapons performed in that incursion. And these are not arms fairs that you get invited to and they're at the same location. And these are arms fairs you get invited to, you rendezvous at a particular point, and you're then taken to a secret location. And to get an invitation to one of those is not an easy thing to do. So Israel's role in the global arms trade, particularly in relation to high-tech weaponry, to cyber weapons, is extremely important and profound. And it's probably one of the reasons why Israeli political life is quite as materially corrupt as it is as well. Huge amounts of corruption allegations around former Prime Minister Netanyahu. 3 arms deals with Germany are shrouded in massive corruption. Prime Minister Ehud Olmert actually spent time in prison after he left office. Charges were being prepared, I believe, against former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon when he went into a coma. And so the scale of the defense industry and the level of the corrupting of the political system, unfortunately, there's probably a very high correlation of those things.
Can you say a bit more about battle tested?
Sure. So, all defense companies, like I suppose any company, will talk about how its weaponry has performed on the battlefield. Unfortunately, whereas with a car, if a company is underreporting certain statistics, be it accidents, faults with cars, be it emissions levels of cars, as we saw with many of the big auto manufacturers who were actually disguising the true levels of their emissions for many years, when there are things that just don't add up, people become less persuaded by the marketing and advertising. We can't do that with weaponry, because fortunately, very few of us actually find ourselves on battlefields. And unfortunately, the information that returns from battlefields is illusory. It's part of a propaganda war. It is not fact. So the American military, when it talks about its weaponry, doesn't talk about the problems with that weaponry. I mean, the best example of that is something that hasn't been battle tested because it just doesn't work well enough to be used. And in my opinion, it's just inappropriate for use in the sorts of conflicts that exist in the world today. And that is the F-35, which is the most expensive weapon system ever developed. And an aerospace design engineer from the Pentagon, who was part of the team that designed the F-16, who appears in the film of The Shadow World, actually says, the best thing about the F-35 is that the only people it's going to endanger are its test pilots, because it is so deeply flawed. And in fact, he's been proven right by the fact that it failed its first, I can't even remember what the number is, 13, 14, 15 test flights. It never made it to the Farnborough Air Show for its European debut because the F-35 that had been identified and had been fitted out with all the high tech that it was going to display at Farnborough caught fire on the runway as it was leaving its American base. The Inspector General in the United States 4 months ago now maybe, so earlier this year, announced that key elements of the core technology of the plane are simply not fit for purpose, and they will have to start from scratch again. And this is a weapons system that has so far cost the American taxpayer well in excess of $1.5 trillion. Now, at the moment, when you go to the arms fairs, and particularly the air shows, be that the Dicey Arms Fair in London, which is one of the biggest, be it in Dubai, where they have one of the largest arms fairs in the world, be it the Paris Air Show, which is probably the biggest aerospace show in the world, you know, Lockheed Martin and the other companies involved in the production of the F-35 are not giving presentations about the problems with the F-35. They're giving presentations based on what it should be able to do. So the weapons battle tested in the occupied territories, Elbit Systems and other such companies are not talking about, at these arms fairs, the civilians that have been killed, the fact that some of those targeted were actually completely innocent, who have been picked up in various forms of surveillance as having a relationship with somebody who is seen as a target and is therefore by association a target, even if it's just that they go to the same pizza place. That's not what we're being told about. We're being told about the examples where it does work in their eyes. I think if you question the entire military system in terms of which it is operating, you have even more fundamental questions to ask. And I, of course, made the mistake at the Paris Air Show once of asking the head of a big defense company aerospace division why he had failed to mention that his company had just been found guilty by the US Department of Justice of bribing a politician, which was a very rare occurrence, but it did happen once. And I honestly thought he was going to physically assault me. There were security guards who had to sort of come between him and me, because the journalists who are allowed into these things don't ask those sort of questions. They don't question the efficacy of the weaponry. They all feed what is a very slick PR operation. So, you know, the tested in the battlefield label, if you will, I think is really just a PR exercise. And I mean, I think another way in which we can communicate about the realities, not just of the weapons, but of the militarism that they reinforce, is by being honest with people, is by showing people on television the realities of what our weaponry is doing in countries like Yemen, the realities of what it is like to go into combat, which I have never done personally. But I was astonished when we were interviewing people for the film to find a combat veteran of many years who helps veterans deal with the psychological trauma of their periods in combat, but who remains very supportive of the US military. I mean, he has written in books that 84% of all elite forces, in this case Marines, who go into conflict in the United States of America, 84% of them soil themselves. Now, we don't see that in Hollywood movies. All we see are the heroes. And everybody is heroic. They're all brave, they're all heroic, they're all defending our democracies. Now, in some cases, that's true, but in many cases, it is not. The United States has invaded more countries around the world than any other country in history. The United States is today engaged in more conflict than any other country in the world. The United States today spends more money on defense and conflict than the next 6 biggest countries combined. Now, most Americans don't even know that. And this is the sort of information that each of us needs to be communicating, especially those of you who work in these sorts of areas and who have the skills that you have. And it's why we make movies and write books and produce social media posts and little video clips that younger people might be interested in watching. And I would strongly encourage all of you, have a look at the book Indefensible that I mentioned at projectindefensible.org, because it's a great way to start conversations with friends and family about these sorts of issues. Because unfortunately, in what some people would describe as the traditional media or the mainstream media, we don't get this side of the story. And the reality is, in some countries, that's because the media is owned by the very same holding companies that own a lot of the defense companies. And a lot of the interests of the big media houses are similar to the interests of big defense companies, which are often similar to the interests of the state. So the media underreports these matters. The Guardian in the UK used to do an enormous amount of work on the British arms trade. Now, you're lucky if you see an article every 2 or 3 months.
Thank you, Andrew. How are you doing? Do you want a couple more questions? Or
I'm happy to go on.
Okay, we'll just do a couple more.
There are people who are interested to listen.
Yeah, we still got over 100 on the call, so we'll just I'll just stick 2 questions together here, and then there's another one somewhere. Do you have any statistics for how much Russia, China, Iran, and others are also involved in corruption around the world? And has the situation in the UK got better or worse over the past few decades?
In terms of corruption?
Yeah.
Okay. That's a very good question. So, in the case of Iran, there is evidence of some low-level corruption, not very much. And the reason for that is because Iran just doesn't have the money. Iran manufactures very little, but it does supply certain groups with weaponry. It tends to be much older weaponry and not very sophisticated weaponry. But certainly you can find weapons that have come through Iran, arming some, not all, but some of the Houthi militias in Yemen. No evidence of corruption, because those are sort of small-scale deals that are being done for geopolitical reasons. So there's no need of the corruption, and I'll explain the sort of the supply side of corruption in a moment. In terms of China, in terms of both Russia and China, I should say, there are no accurate statistics. So we have rather than a normative picture, we have a more subjective picture. And the interesting thing about China is that it uses weapons as currency in corruption, if you will. So yes, there is some financial corruption. So certain countries, and here I've done quite a lot of work, and there's quite a lot in the book about Chinese arms sales across the African continent. And there have been, but by comparison to European companies and previously America, and I'll explain that in a moment, fairly small scale, because it's the weapons themselves. I mean, the weapons are often just sort of basically given away by China because they have been part for almost 20 years now of a massive diplomatic push into the African continent, into parts of South Asia, parts of Southeast Asia. So in other words, their weapons to North Korea, again, they don't need bribes because that's part of a broader geopolitical picture. Russia, there is significant evidence of extensive bribery in Russian arms deals. I recently helped some journalists who are working on a great investigation in I might now get the name wrong, so I'm open to correction here, but I think it was the Republic of Congo, what is sometimes called Congo-Brazzaville. But again, you can see this story on the site OCCRP, which is a very good investigative journalism hub based in Sarajevo into not just arms dealing, but organized criminal networks all over the world. They revealed this extraordinary deal where the agent on the deal, this was a Russia to Congo deal, the agent on the deal both represented the buyer, the government, and he represented the Russian company that was doing the selling. So the agent drafted the contracts for the buyer, made sure the seller liked them, quite obviously, and set all of the bribes. And you'd be shocked to hear that the biggest recipient of the bribes was the agent. And this was the first time I'd come across a deal where one agent represented both the buyers and the sellers, which I suppose from the perspective of the intermediary is a pretty good business model. But it just shows the extent of the corruption in the Russian arms trade. What I wrote a little bit about in the book was Vladimir Putin's personal involvement in arms deals, like many of our politicians. So, for instance, it's interesting to note that Tony Blair has made quite literally tens of millions of pounds directly out of his involvement with companies like BAE Systems and others, with involvement with authoritarian regimes, including Saudi Arabia, who every now and then seem to pay him 9 to 10 million pounds. We're not sure exactly what for. He has made money from companies that benefited directly from the decision to invade Iraq. But Putin, I would imagine, does it in even more opaque ways than Tony Blair. In that my sense is, if there is a major arms deal involving Russia, Putin is likely to benefit materially from that deal. And I think that applies to the gas and oil industries and various other industries as well. And he is a remarkably wealthy man as a consequence. He would, of course, deny that. So in the case of Russia, yes, there is a significant amount of circumstantial evidence. In terms of whether Britain is getting better or worse, this is incredibly difficult to answer definitively. But let me quickly explain one thing to you. From the post-World War II period until the 1980s, the American companies were the biggest corruptors, defense companies were the biggest corruptors on the planet. They were paying vast bribes in all of their deals all over the world. The United States of America passed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And while its implementation varies under different administrations, unsurprisingly, there have been some administrations where it has been fairly strictly enforced. And that has caused American companies to bribe less, defense companies. But they have a huge advantage over their European counterparts. And those of you who are engineers, many of you will be aware of this. When they produce a weapons system, they have a massive economy of scale advantage because they know that 60 or 70 or 80% of that particular system is going to be bought by the Pentagon, because it also buys 40% of all weapons in the world. So by comparison to a European producer of a similar weapons system, the Americans' costs are much lower. And the quality of their equipment, rightly or wrongly, and I'm the wrong person to judge this, all of you might actually be in a better position to judge this, but the quality of its equipment is regarded as very good. Israeli and American equipment is very desirable around the world. We see that, I mean, wherever I went when I was researching the book, if you ask people what sort of equipment they wanted, ideally, it would be American and Israeli. You know, the AK-47 almost for reasons of nostalgia, and that's obviously a small and light weapon, so on a different scale. But the Europeans are therefore having to charge much more for their product, and the general reputation of their products isn't as good as American than Israeli. So their competitive advantage is the scale of their bribes. And I'm afraid to say that there is overwhelming evidence, both objective and subjective evidence, that this is the case. And the UK is certainly a part of that. I think for a period of anywhere between 15 and 17 years, BAE Systems was probably the most corrupt company on the planet. It claims to have cleaned up its act to some extent, but you can never tell in the here and now. You can only tell years down the line because we are dependent on whistleblowers or sources to come forward. And they're often too scared to do that while a deal is being negotiated. But one thing I would say about the United Kingdom, I have never come across an arms deal that I've investigated. And I obviously haven't investigated every arms deal. We just don't have the capacity to do that. But I have never come across an arms deal with Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates that doesn't involve a significant amount of corruption and bribery. And given that they are two of our biggest customers, my instinctive response is right now as we're speaking, the United Kingdom remains a very corrupt operator in the arms space. And I think generally as a society, so not just in the arms trade, I think corruption is probably getting worse. The scale of corruption we are seeing in relation to COVID contracts, for instance, where contracts are awarded to political donors or associates of the most senior politicians who are doling out the contracts, is the most worrying indication I've seen in the UK, what we call in the industry red flags. There are just massive red flags flying all over the UK government at the moment. Contracts are being given, and these are multi-million, if not billion-pound contracts, to people who clearly don't have the capacity to deliver them properly. And there are significant political and or business linkages between those people and very senior politicians in the current government. So I suppose if forced to give an answer, my answer would be that the corruption picture in the UK at the moment is the most worrying I've seen it over the past 20 odd years that I've been doing this work.
Wow, that's amazing. I think that's quite a good point to end on, actually. Do you want to just mention your social media tags and things if people want to follow you?
Yeah. So if you'd like to follow our work, you can see the more in-depth investigations at shadowworldinvestigations.org online. We have a website that has links to the film, to the books, to the videos that we do, etc., etc. I'm very active on social media, primarily on Twitter, where unfortunately I do tweet about other things as well, politics generally, football. I, of course, support a football team that was founded in a weapons factory, which when the Shadow World was published, the chief executive of Arsenal Football Club contacted me because I'd known his father, who was a remarkable doctor in South Africa, who did extraordinary work in townships on HIV and AIDS during the pandemic, the worst of the pandemic in South Africa. He contacted me and asked me to write an article for the club magazine on the irony of my supporting a football team that was founded in a weapons factory, given the work that I do. But I obviously tweet a huge amount about the global arms trade, about the work that we do on the arms trade. And you can find me at my Twitter handle is just my name, Andrew Feinstein, one word, lowercase. And that's the best place to follow me. I do put a lot of events and stuff on Facebook, but don't particularly like it. We're also on Instagram, but I don't like that. When you have a face like this, you tend to avoid social media that is based entirely on photographs, the point of which I can't understand, despite my younger colleagues and my daughter trying to explain it to me. But I'd like to end by saying, first of all, sometimes it can get very depressing talking about this stuff, because it is very depressing. And the state of our world is very depressing. But the reality is, the only people who are going to change this are people like you and me. We can't expect those who hold power, who benefit from all of this, to change it, because they benefit. And there was a wonderful American anthropologist called Margaret Mead, who did a huge amount of work in the Amazon. And towards the end of her life, she commented that history is changed by the actions of small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens. It has always been the case, and it always will be. So don't feel depressed about what we've discussed tonight. Rather feel energized that if you feel uncomfortable about some of what I've been talking about, together we can do something about it, however difficult it might seem. And I say that as somebody who had to flee a country that I never expected to be allowed back into. And 5 years later, my political leader, Nelson Mandela, was released from jail. The ANC had been unbanned, and we soon became the government. And we've had challenges as a government, but we are a democracy. So I have an endless supply of hope and optimism. And that's the note on which I'd like to end tonight.
Wow. Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for attending. That's absolutely fantastic. And see